Imagine it's 1951.
Okay.
You have just founded a country that's, roughly the size of New Jersey.
Right. Pretty tiny.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you are surviving on strict food rationing, and you have virtually no infrastructure at all. Meanwhile, ships are pulling into the port literally every single week.
Wow.
Yeah, and in just 36 months, your national population has completely doubled.
That's just wild to even think about.
Right.
Yeah.
Like, where do you physically put everyone?
Yeah, you can't just, conjure up apartments out of thin air.
Exactly. So if you are listening to this right now, we know you're the kind of person who wants the architecture beneath the headlines. We have an incredible deep dive today exploring materials related to a source called Stone and Spirit, the evolution of Israeli housing.
It's a really fascinating text.
It really is. And the mission here is to uncover how a nation's history, its identity, and its raw survival struggles are quite literally built right into its real estate market.
Right, because it's not just a standard market.
No, not at all. We are tracking a country's transition from throwing up desperate, emergency shelters to managing one of the most highly pressured, complex, modern property markets in the world today.
It's quite a journey.
Okay, let's unpack this, because usually when we discuss real estate, the conversation starts and ends with interest rates or zoning laws or, I don't know, maybe the cost of lumber.
Right, standard economics.
Yeah, but we don't typically start with existential survival.
No, we don't. And to look at this objectively, we really have to understand the specific lens being used by the source here.
Right, tell us about that framing.
So the evolution of this housing market is actually framed around Yom Ha'atzmaut, Israel's Independence Day.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. The housing data isn't just presented as like a ledger of transactions or a list of building permits. It's an economic reflection of what the authors call a narrative of ingathering, rebuilding, expansion, and resilience.
Got it. So it's heavily tied to the national identity.
Exactly. We are going to separate the numbers from the noise today and look at the actual mechanics of this market while, recognizing the profound emotional weight that drives those very mechanics.
Well, let's start with the hard data from the very beginning. May 14th, 1948.
The Declaration of Independence.
Right. We mentioned that population doubling earlier, and the specific numbers in the text are just staggering.
They really are.
By the end of 1951, roughly 687,000 immigrants had arrived.
That's a massive influx for a brand new state.
Right. The state had to somehow house them instantly. It reminds me of like a massive hospital triage tent after a natural disaster.
That's a good way to put it.
You aren't doing elective cosmetic surgery. You were just trying to stop the bleeding.
Exactly.
You don't have the luxury of planning a beautifully integrated neighborhood with parks and bike lanes when hundreds of thousands of people are literally standing there with their suitcases.
That triage tent is the perfect mental model for this.
Because it's purely reactive, right?
Yeah, the state became the supreme, absolute builder purely out of an existential need to just anchor this population.
Right.
What's fascinating here is how this sheer influx fundamentally breaks our standard definition of what real estate even means.
How so?
Well, today we think of property as a wealth-building vehicle or a lifestyle choice.
Sure, yeah, location, location, location.
Exactly. But in 1950s Israel, real estate was a survival mechanism. It was entirely state-driven logistical infrastructure.
I understand the theory there, but mechanically, how did they physically do it?
That's the big question.
Right, because you can't just wish almost 700,000 roofs into existence when you barely have a functioning economy. What did these triage tents actually look like on the ground?
So they manifested primarily as ma'abarat, which are essentially transit camps.
Okay, transit camps.
Yeah, the government deployed temporary solutions. We're talking canvas tents, corrugated tin huts, and just very basic wooden shacks.
Wow.
There was no real insulation, and they had basic communal sanitation at best.
So very, very rough conditions.
Oh, incredibly rough. The state was essentially commandeering open land and rapidly deploying whatever raw materials it could import or, frankly, scrape together.
Wow.
It wasn't a market at all. There were no private developers bidding for zoning permits, no mortgage brokers. It was a centralized command economy operation.
Right, pure top-down control.
Yeah, the government essentially said, we need to clear the immigration ships, put up 1,000 tin huts in this valley by Tuesday, and we'll just figure out the rest later.
It's raw logistics. Just keep the rain off people's heads.
Exactly. And beyond just providing shelter, it was about physical nation building.
What do you mean by that?
Well, Placing these transit camps in specific geographic areas served dual purposes.
Oh, like strategic placement.
Right. It housed the immediate influx, but it also established a physical demographic footprint across the new country's borders.
Wait, I have a massive problem with this trajectory, though.
Okay, what's that?
A triage tent is supposed to be temporary.
Ideally, yes.
But if the influx never really stops, and the government is the sole provider of all these tin huts and transit camps, how does that system not just permanently calcify into a massive, endless public housing grid?
That is the exact risk they faced.
Like, how do you dismantle the tent and build a functioning private hospital? Because the contrast with today's data from the text is giving me whiplash.
The numbers are drastically different today.
Right. The population is over 10 million now, and in 2023, 67.4% of households lived in a home they owned, while 28.6% rented.
Right.
Nearly 70% private home ownership. How do you pivot from a state-mandated tin hut to a thriving private mortgage market?
That pivot is honestly the defining economic achievement of the state, and it was a very slow, deliberate off-ramp engineered through privatization policies.
So they planned it out over time.
Yeah, over the decades, the state transitioned its approach from being the primary provider of raw shelter to acting more as the facilitator of a private market.
Okay, but how?
They did this largely by offloading the permanent public housing that had eventually replaced those initial transit camps.
Wait, how does that actually work mechanically?
Well, the government utilized public housing companies, like one called Amadar.
Okay.
Initially, the state built massive blocks of permanent concrete apartments just to get people out of the tin huts.
Right, an upgrade from the canvas tents.
Exactly. But later, especially starting in the late 70s and then really accelerating in the 90s, the government enacted policies allowing the tenants living in those public housing units to purchase their apartments at steep discounts.
Oh, wow. I see.
Yeah.
They seeded the private market by selling the state assets directly to the citizens who are already living inside them.
That's the exact core of the strategy. You transform a dependent population into property owners.
That's brilliant.
It was. Suddenly, hundreds of thousands of families have equity. They have an asset they can borrow against, sell, or pass down to their children.
Which creates a middle class.
Precisely. And at the same time, the state starts releasing more state-owned land to private developers to build new neighborhoods, rather than the government acting as the sole construction company.
But there is a massive geographical catch here, right?
Oh, absolutely.
We are still talking about a country the size of New Jersey.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you are looking at a classic macroeconomic pressure cooker.
Because of the size limits.
Yes, you have a strictly finite amount of land. In fact, a massive percentage of the land in Israel is still owned by the state or the Jewish National Fund, managed by the Israel Land Authority.
Oh, really? I didn't realize that.
Yeah, so people often don't actually buy the land itself. They buy a long-term lease on the building rights.
That definitely complicates things.
It does. And on top of that finite land supply, you introduce continuous multi-generational demand from a rapidly expanding population.
Right, from both birth rates and immigration.
Exactly. Both natural birth rates and ongoing immigration keep pushing that demand higher.
And when finite land meets infinite demand, the math is totally unforgiving.
Over the last 2 decades, housing prices have risen sharply in many parts of the country for this exact reason.
Supply just can't keep up.
Right. The government can rezone land, but it can't manufacture more of it.
Yeah.
The transition from an emergency stay project to a modern private market was highly successful, but the underlying pressure of population growth against a hard geographical limit never really eased up.
It just changed forms.
Exactly. It just morphed from a logistical crisis into a pricing crunch.
Well, to really wrap my head around that crunch, I feel like national statistics only go so far.
I agree.
10 million people and 67% ownership gives us the macro view, but to truly understand this collision between historical weight, finite land, and modern real estate economics, we need to zoom in.
And the text points us right to the perfect example.
Right. The data points us to the ultimate microcosm for this, which is Jerusalem. Let me walk you through the demographic timeline here, because the growth is honestly staggering.
It really is a unique case study.
So in 1948, Jerusalem had roughly 84,000 residents.
Okay, fairly small.
Very small. But fast forward to the end of 2017, it crossed the 900,000 mark.
Wow.
And by the end of 2023, we were looking at approximately 983,000 residents.
Almost a million.
A city that started with under 100,000 people is now bumping up against a million.
1967 is the pivotal mechanism in that timeline, by the way.
Why is that year so important?
That year marks a completely new era of urban and demographic growth for the city.
Oh, because of the geopolitical shifts.
Exactly. Before 1967, you had a much smaller city marked by division and a relatively stagnant housing stock.
Right.
But after 1967, it expands both physically and demographically. It actually becomes Israel's largest city.
Which brings a whole new set of problems.
Exactly. Managing that scale in this specific location is not like managing growth in, Chicago or London.
Not at all, because you aren't just zoning for a new grocery store or figuring out where to pour concrete for a subway stop. You're zoning around history.
Yes, layers and layers of history.
I was reading in the text that anytime a developer tries to dig a deep foundation for a new apartment building in Jerusalem, they almost inevitably hit an ancient archaeological site.
It happens constantly.
And when that happens, construction just halts, sometimes for months, while the Antiquities Authority comes in to excavate.
That is a very real, tangible constraint on the supply side.
I can't imagine being a developer dealing with that.
It's incredibly difficult. And you also have the physical topography. Jerusalem is built on mountains and valleys, so you can't just sprawl easily in every direction like you could on a flat plain.
Right, you're boxed in.
And add to that the unique zoning laws. For instance, there is a municipal law dating all the way back to the British Mandate that requires all buildings in Jerusalem to be faced with local Jerusalem stone.
Wait, every single building?
Yes. It preserves the city's iconic aesthetic, of course, but it significantly increases construction costs and build times.
Wow, that is a huge hurdle.
It is. So you have all these complex neighborhood development challenges layered over the long-term planning hurdles of managing a city sacred to multiple faiths.
Right.
Every single square meter of land has a stakeholder.
Which brings us right to the core economic issue here. How do you actually value a property when it represents identity, continuity, access, and belonging?
It's practically unquantifiable.
Right. I was trying to think of an analogy for this, and it feels like a stock that pays absolutely zero financial dividends, but investors refuse to sell it because holding that stock gives them voting rights in a company they are deeply emotionally attached to.
That's a great comparison.
On paper, to a strict economist, holding it behaves completely irrationally, but to the shareholder it makes total sense. They aren't buying it for the quarterly yield. They are buying it for a seat at the table.
This raises an important question. What happens to the standard economic supply and demand curve when the asset in question carries that kind of emotional and spiritual weight?
It has to break the curve, right?
Exactly. The market begins to behave entirely differently. The data indicates that in Jerusalem, property has never been exclusively about square meters.
No, it's about so much more.
People are purchasing a piece of their own historical continuity. And this artificially inflates demand because buyers are willing to pay a premium that just defies standard economic logic.
Like they will sacrifice other living standards, they'll cram a family into a significantly smaller apartment, or take on a massive mortgage just to secure a Jerusalem zip code.
Yes, absolutely. And that demand isn't just local, it's international too.
Oh, from the diaspora.
Right. You have diaspora populations purchasing apartments they might only live in for, say, a few weeks a year during holidays.
Leaving them empty the rest of the time.
Often, yes. They are treating the property as a physical tether to their identity.
Wow.
So you have this deeply emotional global demand competing for a very limited local supply of housing in a city where building new housing is legally, archaeologically, and topographically agonizing.
But here is where reality hits hard, though.
Yeah.
You still have to live in a real-world economy. The emotional value of that legacy stock is beautiful, but you cannot pay your electric bill or buy groceries with historical continuity.
You really can't.
The spiritual weight of Jerusalem is actively crashing headfirst into modern affordability challenges.
Because the laws of economics don't care about your emotional attachment. The math always comes due eventually.
Let's drop some specific stats from the Jerusalem Institute that were mentioned.
Okay, let's hear them.
In Jerusalem right now, about 62% of households own their homes, and about 38% rent from private individuals.
Right. But here's where it gets really interesting. Rental prices in Jerusalem are, on average, higher than the national average, but they are still well below Tel Aviv's premium. It sits in this fascinating economic middle ground.
That makes sense, though. Tel Aviv is the absolute peak of the pure commercial and tech market, driven by very high salaries in those specific sectors.
Right, it's the economic engine.
Exactly. But Jerusalem's prices, while slightly lower than Tel Aviv's, actually create a much more severe affordability crunch when you factor in the local economy.
Why is that?
Well, Jerusalem has a high concentration of public sector jobs, religious institutions, and generally larger family sizes.
Oh, I see.
The local wages often just don't align with the housing costs, which are being driven up by that emotional and international demand we just discussed.
So it creates a massive mismatch between what the local population earns and what the housing market actually demands.
Yes, and the broader institutional data breaks down why this tension is so chronic.
What does the data say? The Bank of Israel has repeatedly pointed out the structural gap between strong demand and limited supply across the entire country. But in Jerusalem, the friction is uniquely intense.
And the most recent data shows no signs of this easing either.
Unfortunately not.
The Central Bureau of Statistics reported a brief cooling period in the housing market in 2023, which was likely due to interest rate hikes and broader economic uncertainty.
Right, standard market forces.
But then, annual dwelling price increases resumed right away in 2024. The pressure gauge dipped for just a second and then went right back to climbing.
Which forces us to look at what this actually means for the average family living there.
It's gotta be tough.
It is. We have this beautiful narrative framing from the historical data, turning history into a home, resilience, rebuilding a nation.
The Hutzmat framing.
Exactly. But the on-the-ground reality of that high demand and constrained supply is an incredibly punishing economic environment. Every apartment block and stone facade is indeed part of a larger national story of return, but we have to impartially observe that this miracle of growth brings an immense financial burden.
It's essentially a double-edged sword.
Very much so.
The state successfully executed the impossible. They transitioned from putting people in tin transit camps to creating a thriving, modern, privately owned property market.
A huge accomplishment.
They successfully built up the historical capital into a city of 1 million people. But the reward for all that success is a real estate market so highly pressured that it becomes a massive struggle for an average family to actually afford the home they spent generations trying to get back to.
The transition from an emergency shelter mechanism to an in-demand, highly prized private asset is entirely complete.
Right.
But the very success of that transition is exactly what created the modern affordability crisis. You cannot have a highly desirable, globally sought-after asset on finite land without eventually pricing out a significant portion of the local population.
So what does this all mean? Let's trace the full arc of the architecture we've unpacked today.
Let's do it.
We start in the emergency era of 1948, watching a resource-strained state act as a triage hospital, throwing up transit camps to absorb nearly 700,000 immigrants by 1951.
Unprecedented logistics.
Truly. And then we explored the mechanisms of how that centralized, state-run shelter system slowly privatized, selling off public housing stock to citizens to seed a modern property market where nearly 70% of households are homeowners today.
The big off-ramp.
Exactly. Finally, we zoomed in on Jerusalem, a microcosm that grew from 84,000 to nearly 1 million residents.
A completely different scale.
We saw how topography, archaeological constraints, and the deep emotional desire for historical continuity actively warped the supply and demand curve, driving up prices in a city where construction is already incredibly difficult.
It really is a perfect storm.
It is a profound look at how a nation's history and its economic realities are inextricably linked.
It is a remarkable economic evolution. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to just mull over.
I love these. Let's hear it.
We've spent this time examining how property in Israel, and specifically Jerusalem, represents a profound sense of continuity and belonging.
Right.
But as the data shows, prices are resuming their climb into 2024 due to that relentless demand and limited supply.
Yeah, the pressure is back on.
It forces a rather difficult question. If prices continue to escalate, pushing out younger generations or new arrivals who simply cannot afford that seat at the table, premium does a housing market that was originally designed to gather up people risk eventually pricing them out of the very home they return to.
Wow. That is a brilliant and heavy question to end on.
It's definitely something to think about.
It's the exact kind of economic paradox that defines modern history. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep examining the structures around you. Keep looking for the hidden mechanics in the blueprints. And above all, keep questioning the world around you. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.